This is part 4 of the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grants Project webinar. Your presenter is Stephen Randolph with FEMA Region 10.
So there's some additional project elements that we're going to go through, and here's what they are, and we'll talk about each one. The decision-making process to why did you choose that alternative? Remember when I talked about in project scoping, document, the process that you used, the meetings that you went, the community meetings that were held, some of the outcomes of those meetings, etc., that needs to be documented. And why does that need to be documented? Because if it's a project, it requires environmental review, and the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, requires that FEMA, in order to comply with federal environmental laws, must look at the alternatives that were considered to the preferred alternative that is proposed in the project. A typical thing is one alternative is no action, okay? And the other one is some sort of reasonable alternative. One of the examples I use is, so you want to do a buyout. Flood elevation was an alternative that was considered, but was determined to be infeasible. We talk about damage history, property and facility data, engineering feasibility, cost effectiveness, and environmental historic preservation. Damage history, this is something new that we've not talked about so much. I mentioned it earlier in why do you need to, what's the problem you're trying to fix? You've already collected some data. This is what it's talking about. This is super, super important for some benefit cost analyses. It's less important for others, but it does help anyone who is reviewing the project understand the magnitude of the problem or the repetitiveness of the problem, and that's why you're trying to deal with the issue. So, for example, if you're doing a flood buyout, the flood insurance claims paid, that's really super, but what if they didn't have flood insurance? Then you need to explain the flood event, how high the water got in the house, how long it was there, and an estimate of the damages. We actually have a method in our benefit cost analysis system where we can figure out the damages if you tell us what the depth of flooding was. For road projects, for utility infrastructure projects, this information is extremely critical. The number of days without function, and there are formulas for different utilities and how much you get to claim for the number of hours or number of days you're without function. The detour time necessary for getting around the road that got flooded out. The daily traffic on that road that got flooded out from the Department of Transportation. Let's see. Oh, and the cost to repair the damages. So all of those things are needed. Like I shared with you, there was a really bad flood here in Washington in 2006. There was another one in 2007, and another one in some parts of the state in 2009. So there's relatively recent information. If you don't know what it is, tell us what the characteristics were. If you say, I don't know how much damage was done, try to find it. Okay, or tell us how deep the floodwaters were, or how long the bridge was out, and there's some ways that the estimated damages, the estimated functional loss can be determined. And a lot of times I will say almost always in presidential disaster declarations, the community has applied for public assistance to fix the damaged roads and bridges and buildings and the like. And so there is a public assistance worksheet that identifies the damages. You can reference those. We don't have them here on our site, so you have to tell us what they were. Just because we're FEMA, please know there's a huge silo between us and the public assistance disaster program. And we've had some wonderful, I'm thinking of FEMA project in Clatskanie, Oregon, where they sent us pictures of the motel flooded. way back into the 60s. They had some pictures from the 60s of floodwaters 3 feet high through the whole motel. We just bought that motel out for $1.3 million last year.
Wow.
Okay, enough of that. That's something that's important. Project facility data. So we have something that's called, there's two things in this slide. One is there's this thing that we have that's called a property site inventory, where we put a whole bunch of data in based on an address associated with a particular property. And that actually is shared by all of our databases in not with our public assistance and individual assistance databases. Again, big barrier there. In the computer systems, we don't share data. So they can't pull that data from either. So for each property, we need information about the, the tax lot number, the acreage, what kind of building is it, what square footage, the actual, the age of the structure. Please attach the assessor's report on that structure. If there is one, a lot of tribal properties don't have that, and I recognize that. Replacement cost value, that can be a toughie, but we have books here at FEMA that this is one time we can help you with developing your project application. Is if you need a replacement cost value for a single-family 2-story house in Juneau, we can help you with that because we have books from the National Home Builders Institute that are provided on an annual basis that give us a locality-adjusted dollar per square foot cost. And why replacement cost value is important. That's what goes into the benefit cost analysis, not the actual current fair market value of the house, which is depreciated. And as a result of that, you get more benefits associated with that. Displacement costs, how long were people out of their home? Did they have to rent? Was the public works building flooded? What happened to the records? All this kind of stuff. Some of that's really important. This is also, there's a bunch of the data fields in this that are asked for in the benefit cost analysis, which we're going to talk about next, that are very dependent upon what particular kind of project that you're doing. So I'm not going to go into all that detail, but I'll just tell you that there's some, between the damage history data and this property facility data, there's a lot of data fields that are necessary to complete a benefit cost analysis. Okay, facilities, we're talking about infrastructure here, roads, bridges, water lines, sewer lines, water treatment plants, sewer treatment plants. I know that some tribes have power plants that create, basically giant generators that create the electrical power for the community, the power grid itself, tidal gates, floodgates, various things associated with irrigation canal systems. It's another thing. So again, tell us what it is, customer serve, physical damage estimates, what's the loss of function impact, the value of the service, if it's road damage, what's the length for detours, okay? So engineering feasibility documentation, you need to know FEMA will require 10% design, conceptual design, whatever they call it, for any project that you want to build or a seismic retrofit. Not necessary for a flood elevation unless it's for a larger building, public building usually. You'll need to tell them what the building code, engineering standards. We do accept engineering designs from registered professional engineers. We're not going to our engineers are not going to go back through and redesign the building for you, okay? Level of protection provided by the proposed project, 25-year flood, 120-mile-an-hour winds. This is really important for seismic projects. Are you going for life safety so the building doesn't collapse, or are you going for immediately inhabitable so that the building functions after an earthquake event? And what level of earthquake event are you designing to? Okay, enough that. Engineering, okay, residual risk. This is something most people don't realize exists. But let's say the only time a residual risk does not occur is if you do a 100-year flood buyout. There's no risk after that, okay, period. But you elevate a house, there's even a residual risk, even if you elevate it above the 100-year flood, because there can be damage around the foundation. So there's a residual risk. I think that makes sense, that the building site's still going to get flooded. There could still be debris that bangs up against the foundation, that maybe a debris takes a deck off or something like that, or crashes into the heat pump that's elevated, okay? Still, there can be damages, so it's not a 100% solution. But what we're really talking about here is if you design a stormwater project to a 25-year flood event, at the 26-year flood event, there's going to be damages, okay? Not much. And at the 50-year flood event, there's definitely going to be damages. But you know what? That 25-year storm design reduced the damages at the 50-year level, because it accommodated more flow. So the damages are still less at 50 and at higher events, but there will be damages. That's what we're talking about that. A lot of times that's left out. And then just which standard, which building code, which engineering design are they using. The engineers are usually really pretty good about that. So I'm not concerned about that, but I've had problems with the National Technical Review Team pushing back on projects that we knew were going to be required to be built to the Washington State Building Code, but they didn't know anything about the Washington State Building Code, and they didn't know if this county had adopted the Washington State Building Code, because guess what? There's whole tons of counties, millions of people in the Midwest that are not covered by building codes. So even though there might be a state of Iowa building code, not everybody adopted it. And so they were saying, we don't know, that they have to tell us. We didn't even know to ask that of our states. Okay, resources, your consulting engineer, your public works department. There is actually a resource, the FEMA Building Sciences Help. Those case studies that I shared with you before have some sample engineering and some engineering checklists and things. So there's some things that can help with that, but I think this is one of those situations where talking to another community, another tribe that's already done this, and definitely working with your tribal engineer that's on retainer. That's the best way to go. Okay. Cost effectiveness. Well, so Office of Management Budget requires that all FEMA projects be cost effective, quote unquote, air quotes here. And what is cost effective? It is a benefit cost ratio of 1.0 or greater. Well, what does that mean? That's the cumulative annualized benefits of the project over the life of the project. So it's the annualized benefits for each year of a 35-year life for a stormwater project, times 35, if they exceed the cost of the project now, and in that particular case, the estimated maintenance costs over that 35-year lifespan. If that is good, you're good as gold, okay? If, for example, you come in and you say, wow, I did the work and, you know, we only come up with $78,000 worth of benefits and our project's $100,000. Well, here's two situations, okay? Number one, if you just look at it just that way, you've got a gray infrastructure project, let's say, and it's $78,000. Or you've got a flood buyout and it's only $78,000. There's some situations where you just would have to say, no, we can't submit it. It's not going to be cost effective. But I tell you what, don't give up. Call the Benefit Cost Analysis Helpline. I can't begin to tell you how many things are undercounted or not accounted for that are valid benefits for projects. Almost every project that the initial benefit cost analysis comes in below 1.0 actually has more benefits that we can find and count toward it. If it's good mitigation, if it's something that just makes sense at reducing the vulnerability of that facility, building, whatever, to a natural hazard, likely or not, it's a cost-effective project. We just need to show that. Now, there's two things that help with buyouts and with stormwater projects. and that is that you can count ecosystem services. If you reach $75,000 worth of benefits for a $100,000 project, and it's a buyout or a stormwater project, that other $25,000 can be made up of ecosystem services. Oh, you must use FEMA-approved methodology. If no BCA is attached, it's automatically disqualified. It does not go through National Technical Review at all. And we have had that happen, unfortunately. BCA modules are free. They're downloadable. You go to the FEMA BCA website, which we'll give you a link to. There's specific modules for specific hazards: flood, seismic, wildfire, landslide, and aquifer storage and recovery all have their own systems. You may have to contact us or the BC helpline, I should say, for the landslide spreadsheet and for the one that they use for aquifer storage and recovery. Damage frequency analysis is what has to be used for most road and infrastructure projects, and that one is a magic box. It can take those old damage records that you have. If you knew that there was, the road was out for 4 days in 1998, it was out again for 3 days in 2001, and it was down, the whole bridge washed out, and it took us 3 months to replace it in 2006. Guess what? You put that information in, it creates its own frequency and assigns the benefits associated. So the higher the frequency event, the more benefits are associated with it. There's some BCA special cases. So if your structure was substantially damaged by flood, and it's in a mapped FEMA floodplain, Special Flood Hazard Areas, what it's called, SFHA. That means the 100-year floodplain or the 1% chance floodplain. And it was damaged by 50%. Again, this is based on 50% of, in this case, of the fair market value of the structure. This is a benefit. So if the cost to repair the damages, which are based on replacement costs, are $40,000, and that house was only valued at $35,000, then you have a substantial damage situation. More typically what we see is there's $100,000 worth of repairs, and the house may be worth $150,000 because the repairs are counted at the cost, the current market conditions of construction costs. But the value of the house that it's compared against is the fair market value at current value, which is depreciated. So that house may have been a 2,000 square foot house that would cost or $410,000 if it were built right now, and so that $100,000 worth of damage doesn't meet 50%. But in reality, the house was built in 1960, and it's only worth $160,000 right now, current fair market value, because of the depreciation of all the building components and utility systems and everything else. But if the repair costs are based on current costs, and those repair costs are $100,000, well, guess what? That's more than 50% of the current market value of the structure. That means you qualify for what's called a substantial damage waiver. The substantial damage 50% rule is what it's called. The National Flood Insurance people talk about it all the time. Okay. Pre-calculated benefits. Hi. So if you're doing or flood elevations, FEMA has determined that $276,000 per house or $175,000 per house for flood elevations are cost effective. If your project costs less than that, you don't have to do a benefit cost analysis. Plain and simple. And guess what? You get to do a locality adjustment for higher construction costs, which are typical here in the Pacific Northwest and really high in Alaska. So we take that 276 and multiply it by the multiplier, and a lot of times here in the Seattle metro area, that's around $350,000 to $370,000. If your project buyout was $500,000, then you have to go do the BCA, but you use the flood module, and you use the flood insurance study, helps with that, and it'll work out. Then there's also pre-calculated benefits for post-wildfire. If your project, revegetation erosion control project, is at or less than $52.50 an acre, you don't have to do a benefit cost analysis. It's already done for you. Ecosystem services benefits for acquisitions of hazard-prone property. The highest are for flood because floodplain areas have the highest ecosystem services benefits, up to about $36,000 per acre per year over the life of a 100-year buyout. But floodplain restoration, flood diversion, and stormwater projects also have ecosystem services. BCA documentation, wow. So the zip file for the BCA run has to be attached in eGrants so that they can rerun it. If it's not attached, the project's rejected. Data documentation template is something that goes through all the different fields and says, well, if you use the FEMA defaults, great. If you're not using the FEMA defaults, what are you using and why, and what's the source for that data? And then you have to attach the source for that data as well. If you're just using the FEMA defaults, you don't have to worry about that. The frequency of flooding events and damage or earthquake or whatever and the damages data is really critical, and it's been a major problem with eligibility determination. BCA documentation must be accurate and sufficiently detailed to effectively and efficiently review the development of the BCA and how the benefit cost ratio was derived. The benefit cost ratio, of course, has to be 1.0 or greater. Aggregation means that you can take a bunch of structures, some that may have an individual rate over 1.0 and others that have a rate below 1.0, but if all of them taken together are above 1.0, you add them all up and divide by the number of properties, then the aggregated BCA is above 1.0, and all of those structures that were below can be part of the project. That's really cool. Field delivery, we do them almost, like I said, almost every year in Oregon, Washington, actually all 4 states here in the Northwest, because guess what? We get disasters declared every year. And it's pretty easy for us to charge that training to the disaster and have it deployed out here. Contractors of FEMA come out and do it. There's also courses at the Emergency Management Institute, which is FEMA's own training facility, and the National Fire Academy facility at Emmitsburg, Maryland. BCA website, there's where to go to download all of those wonderful BCA modules. And there's the Technical Assistance Helpline. Now I'm going to go back up to the second line. If you are going to be applying for the same kind of project for several years in a row, like you know you're going to be doing a lot of flood elevations, a little bit at a time, it's worth somebody in the community learning how to do the benefit cost analysis. If you're not, if this is, you're going to do flood elevations this year, next year we're going to do generators, next year we're going to do a seismic retrofit, it is not worth your time to learn how to do this because you won't remember it the next year when you go to do the different module. I will tell you that all the infrastructure retrofit projects that we see, water lines, sewer lines, roads, etc., contracting consultants do the BCAs because it's the only way to figure out how to use the damage frequency analysis without royally blowing it up. I will tell you that for seismic retrofits, you have to use a consulting engineer, period, because the data fields that are required, only an engineer knows what they mean and understands them, and that engineer has to be the guy or gal that did the seismic vulnerability analysis of the structure because they have to know the details of the inside of that structure and how it was built before they can fill in the BCA module. Flood module, for doing buyouts or doing elevations, that is one I would say people could get trained on easily and do, especially if you're going to do it over and over again. And then it's well worth your while having an in-house expert. Preservation planning. What you need to know is FEMA staff or contractors conduct the environmental historic preservation review of all projects that are selected for further review. That doesn't mean you can't help, but FEMA is the one who has to sign off on a finding of no significant impact, or sign off on a CADEX, or sign off on biological assessment. or in the granddaddy of all things, an environmental impact statement. But you know what? You can include in your project budget to hire a contractor to work with FEMA to prepare the environmental assessment if one's required. And it will be required for any in-water work, period. Know that in advance. Our environmental staff will work with you, and they will definitely work with a contractor, and they will oversee what the contractor is doing and make sure it meets FEMA standards and all that. But nonetheless, somebody else doing that work that they then review and bless off on is a lot easier than them doing the work or us hiring it out. You can often, usually, almost 100% of the time, accelerate the environmental review process for a project if you offer to hire the contractor to do the environmental review. Now, there's a lot of projects that don't need a detailed environmental review, that have a categorical exclusion, which we call a CADEX. Buyouts, most flood elevations, a lot of smaller projects, seismic retrofits, unless it's a historic building, they usually don't require a major environmental review. But in-stream work, stormwater management, infrastructure protection projects that involve streams, those usually do. So it's really helpful as you prepare the application to include a lot of data that can help our environmental team quickly assess how much effort it's going to take for them to do the review. And there's a bunch of different environmental acts that we have to address. And they're laid out here: floodplain management, endangered species, wetlands, environmental justice, historic preservation, which includes archaeological resources, which are critical to tribes. And FEMA has just created special technical supplements by project type that are specifically for developing environmental documentation for those project types. One is a job aid, which is a short checklist that pretty well shows you what's needed at time of application and what can be done after your project is selected. And then there's an extremely detailed EHP supplement that walks you through every step of the way and talks about all kinds of issues and situations and what's needed for those. They are tremendous. They're good, okay? So they are found at that website, and these are the top 8 documents. And so it's documents number 4 to 11 and the top 11 documents on that page. A lot of people don't even know those are out there. So unit summary, we have a schedule, we have a budget, we have a scope of work, makes for a quality triangle that stands on its own feet, doesn't fall over. It includes eligibility, cost effectiveness, the building blocks, engineering feasibility, and environmental compliance, the sub-application content, scope of work, schedule, cost estimate, feasibility, benefit cost analysis, and environmental historic preservation documentation. And guess what? I have some more technical assistance at that same website. The top 3 documents turn out to be 20-page documents on 3 project types: acquisition, both demolition and acquisition relocation, flood elevation, flood risk reduction, that are what I will call technical supplements to help you put together the scope of work in your application. They are incredibly detailed and incredibly useful. Please do not be turned off on them. If you actually start reading through them, they make a lot of sense. And they're well written and they have examples. So please, 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 if you're doing any of those project types, go to that website and download that and use it. And in closing, this is our new FEMA Region 10 Hazard Mitigation Assistance shared website. Please email us if you have questions afterwards that we haven't addressed. You can email us there. We also have the opportunity of holding a conference call technical assistance visit that we schedule with the tribe. So we're really low staffed, So we have to kind of go through this portal, but we will be responsive in getting back to you.